Americans spend more money on healthcare than anywhere else in the world, and it's not by just a few percentage points. The U.S. spends twice as much on healthcare than any other high-income nations, racking up close to $10,000 a year per capita compared to less than $5,000 elsewhere. But despite all the spending, the U.S. has a lower average life expectancy than 27 similarly developed countries like Japan, the U.K., Greece, and Canada, higher infant mortality rates than 32 of those countries, and fewer nurses, doctors, hospital beds, and diagnostic tools like MRIs and CT scanners on average, not to mention the 44 million Americans who were underinsured last year. We're not exactly getting what we're paying for, so what are we getting wrong? The dean of Boston University's School of Public Health, Sandro Galea, says the way Americans think about health is a major part of the problem. He makes this case in his great new book. It's called Well, What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health, and he joins me now. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Who is Blind Willie Nelson, and why do you say we're all Blind Willie Nelson?
Blind Willie Johnson. Blind Willie Johnson is a blues player. He was born in Texas around the turn of the 20th century. And Blind Willie was born sighted, and the story is that when he was about 7, he lost his eyesight in a domestic violence incident. He grew up poor, black, blind in Texas in the early 1900s. He was homeless as well for a while. When he was 40, he developed malaria. His wife took him to hospital, and he was turned away from hospital, and then he died. So the reason the story matters is, well, what killed Blind Willie Johnson? What killed him was malaria. Had he had treatment for his malaria, he would have lived. But when I tell that story, it becomes clear that it wasn't just malaria. It was also homelessness and racism and poverty and domestic violence. And that's the mistake that we keep making on health. We focus only on malaria and we ignore everything else.
And we only focus on healthcare and not health. You say we conflate those two
We conflate the two because every single time we think about health, we think about malaria, not everything else that leads up to it.
You know, your book is such a common sense thing, and I'm thinking after I read it, why are we so clueless about these things? And I concluded, and you'll tell me if you disagree, we're not clueless at all. We choose to focus on the thing we think we can solve as opposed to the far bigger problem and the more important problem, which most of us think, particularly in this anti-government era that started, by the way, long before Donald Trump, that we can't tackle those problems. Is that analysis right or wrong?
I think in part you're right. And you start off with some data about the fact that our health is much worse than all other high-income countries. The one thing you did not say was it wasn't always like that. In fact, about 35 years ago, we were in the top half of the heap compared to our peer countries.
U.S.
In the U.S. Yeah. So we have, the tide has turned. In the past 35 years, we have essentially gone to the bottom of the heap. So
why?
Something changed, and I think it's what you're referring to, is that we have entered an era of extreme individualism, and we have lost sight of the fact that health is a public good, and no matter what we say, your health and my health are interlinked, and it's interlinked among all of us, and we need to invest in the structures around us to make us healthy.
I would also argue it's part of that in tough times we like to blame others for things, and we like to think, as you suggest, I don't know if you make the same connection I do, that it's easier to blame people for their individual choices than to blame all of us for our societal choices.
It is, and we're wrong about choice. We tend to think that we have infinite choice, so we tend to blame people, finger wag at them, say you should eat healthy, you should exercise more. But you're not going to exercise more if there are no parks and no places for you to exercise. You're not going to eat healthy if you cannot access food, you cannot access healthy foods which are nutrient rich and calorie poor. So these are decisions we make as a society that constrain our individual choices.
So did you weep like I did when Bill Clinton said the era of big government is over, or was it just okay? So, you know, it seems to me that one of the great ironies of this for me, I was doing a little research as I was reading your book, and the odd part is one person who appears to have gotten part of this is the current Secretary of Health and Human Services, Alex Azar. I'm just going to read part of what he said at an event in November of last year. What if we went beyond connection and referrals? What if we provided solutions for the whole person, including addressing housing, nutrition, and other social needs? We believe we could spend less money on health care, most important, help Americans live healthier lives, if we did a better job of aligning federal health investments with our investments in non-health care needs. You could have said those exact same words, couldn't you?
I agree with Secretary Azar completely. And so what's interesting about this is, you said a few minutes ago, it's sort of a common sense argument. I have yet to meet people who say, when they hear this argument, say, That's probably wrong. Most people agree it's right. So what we need to do is to change the conversation so that we agree enough it's right so we can change how we operate.
Well, the conversation seems to, I'm generally not a very hopeful person, but here there are at least some examples. I mean, I've read and we've discussed on our radio show, in the UK, for example, there's social prescriptions. Go take a cooking class.
Yes.
Go take an art
Yes.
class so you're not socially isolated. Other baby steps, housing prescriptions in a whole bunch of states. I know the request for waivers from Medicaid
Yes.
to allow Medicaid to be spent on things like housing. That's exactly the kinds of things we need, yes?
Exactly, and I'm optimistic. We are actually heading in this direction. You're seeing systems do interesting, creative things.
Like,
Now,
give me a good example.
well, for example, with hospital systems buying air conditioners for people to prevent asthma attacks because of stifling apartments. That's a very simple, tangible example. And obviously there are systems doing much bigger things. It's really, we're seeing innovation in private self-contained systems, places like Kaiser, for example. And we need to just see it on a much larger scale.
And I assume part of the motivation for this is not just caring about our fellow man and woman, but in the long run, it's cheaper, is it not, to invest on things on the front end rather than try to fix the bad outcomes at the other end?
It is,
yes?
and I think that's what Secretary Azar is getting at. In my more technical book, I actually talk about return on investment, and I talk about how if we did this right, we would return much more on our investment than what we're doing by investing in drugs.
So should we assume if Azar gets it, that Trump gets it, or...
Oh, well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to comment
you're
about
not
that.
Now, I was confused by something. If you go to your website, well, let me play a song for you, and maybe you can tell me why I'm playing it. One of my favorite Beatles songs is Eleanor Rigby. Here's just a little taste.
Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice in the church where a wedding has been.
Now, I think I'm supposed to play that and listen to it when I'm reading your chapter
Yes.
called People.
Yes.
Is that right? Why?
So you know, I'm an academic, so I've made my career writing academic papers. And what I set out to do with this book is to tell stories. So the idea was, can we also match the stories to music? So Eleanor Rigby is intended to supplement people to think about loneliness. Loneliness is one of the biggest factors that drives poor health, and we should as a society develop ways to deal with it. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have 20 songs, one for each chapter, to match the themes of the book?
It actually is fun. You know, one other thing, by the way, that there's been bipartisan support for in the state, earned income tax credit. In your chapter on
Yes.
money, you talk about
I do.
that. A refundable tax credit for low-income working people, for the most part,
do.
with kids for the most part, which can change the world, no?
It could. It's ultimately recognizing that economic opportunity makes an enormous difference, and particularly economic opportunity for children. And I'm often asked, if there's one thing we could do, what would it be? And the one thing it would be to create better lives for children at an early age, better education and economic opportunity. And if we did that, it will change the trajectory of health for the next 40, 50 years.
Great concept, great book. Pleasure to see you.
Thank you for having
so
me.
much.
It's a pleasure.
Sandro Galea, thanks again. The book is Well, What We Need to Talk About When We Talk About Health.